Victoria's laughter echoed in the dimly lit restaurant, sharp and crystalline like a blade slicing through the air. People turned to glance at her, drawn by the sheer audacity of her amusement. She was beautiful, effortlessly so. Her emerald green dress hugged her body perfectly, her hair cascaded in soft waves over one shoulder, and her lips, painted in the deepest shade of red, curled into a smirk of satisfaction. Across from her, Daniel sat motionless, his fingers lightly tracing the rim of his whiskey glass. His face was unreadable, his brown eyes fixed on her, absorbing everything. He didn't flinch when she leaned forward, resting her manicured hand on the table, her diamond bracelet catching the light. "You'll never find someone like me," she purred, her voice smooth, confident. For the briefest moment, Daniel allowed himself to consider her words. They were meant as a taunt, a final act of dominance before she walked away with her new prize, the man she had chosen over him. Alex stood near the entrance, waiting, oblivious to the storm Victoria had just ignited. Daniel didn't reply. He didn't beg, didn't question, didn't even raise an eyebrow. He simply took a slow sip of his drink, letting the warmth of the whiskey burn away any remaining sentiment. His silence unnerved her, just for a second, a flicker of hesitation in her expression. But she quickly masked it with another smirk. "Goodbye, darling," she said, standing gracefully. "Try not to dwell on it too much." He watched as she walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her posture exuding the kind of arrogance that only came from someone who believed themselves untouchable. She didn't look back. That was her mistake. Daniel exhaled slowly, placing his glass down with deliberate care. He didn't feel anger. No resentment, no heartbreak, no desperate need for revenge. What he felt was something colder, sharper, a quiet certainty that she had just written the ending to her own story. She just didn't know it yet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he opened the folder he had started weeks ago. Screenshots, bank statements, a collection of details, small at first but growing, breadcrumbs leading to a truth Victoria had been too careless to cover up. She thought she was untouchable, but Daniel had always been a patient man. He had no intention of chasing her, no desire to waste energy on futile vengeance. He would do something far more effective. He would simply step aside and let gravity do the rest. And when she finally realized she was falling, when she reached out in panic, searching for someone to catch her, she would find nothing but air. Daniel signaled the waiter for the check, his mind already calculating the next steps. Victoria thought this was the end of their story. She was wrong. It was just the beginning. Daniel never needed to lift a finger. That was the beauty of it. He understood that the most powerful force in the world wasn't aggression, it was inevitability. Given enough time, the truth had a way of surfacing, unraveling carefully woven lies and exposing the arrogance of those who thought themselves untouchable. Victoria had always been reckless. She thrived on attention, on power, on knowing she had the upper hand. She played people like chess pieces, moving them at her convenience, discarding them when they no longer served a purpose. But there was one flaw in her game. She assumed she was always the smartest person in the room. Daniel knew better. While she basked in the glow of her new life with Alex, he simply watched. He didn't interfere. He didn't warn. He just observed, collecting moments like puzzle pieces, waiting for the inevitable picture to form. And it didn't take long. It started with small things, Victoria slipping into work late more often, her usual charm not as effortless as before. She had always been meticulous, but now cracks began to show. A few careless emails, a missing invoice, an expense report that didn't quite add up. Daniel didn't have to dig too deep. The information was already there, hiding in plain sight. A quiet tip to her firm's internal compliance team. A forwarded email to the right department. Just enough to raise an eyebrow, to plant the seed of doubt. The whisper of potential fraud, the kind that, if traced back correctly, would lead straight to Victoria's desk. He wasn't concerned about what would happen next. He already knew. Companies didn't tolerate mistakes, not when money was involved, and Victoria, despite her confidence, had underestimated how much goodwill she had already burned through. Her colleagues, once eager to bask in her presence, now kept their distance. Her superiors, who once praised her ambition, now scrutinized her every move. One slip up, that was all it would take, and Daniel had a feeling it was coming soon. Meanwhile, on the surface, Victoria was still reveling in her victory. With Alex, she had upgraded, not just financially, but socially. He was the kind of man who opened doors effortlessly, who commanded respect simply by existing. The type of man Victoria had always wanted. But beneath the champagne toasts and luxurious weekends, something was off. Alex wasn't Daniel. He wasn't meticulous. He wasn't patient. He wasn't the type of man to sit quietly and listen, to indulge her games, to let her bask in her own reflection without demanding something in return. Victoria had always been the center of attention in her relationships, but Alex had his own gravitational pull, one stronger, colder. The first time he canceled a dinner plan last minute, she brushed it off. The second time, she felt the sting of irritation. By the third, she understood. She wasn't in control here. Alex had other priorities: business, power, connections, and while Victoria was a stunning accessory to his life, she was just that, an accessory, not a necessity, not an irreplaceable force. She had traded stability for status. And Daniel, watching from the sidelines, knew exactly where this was going. Because men like Alex didn't choose women like Victoria for love. They chose them for convenience. And the moment she stopped being convenient, the moment she became a liability, she would be cast aside just as easily as she had discarded Daniel. The first real blow came on a Thursday. Victoria arrived at work, heels clicking sharply against the office floor, head held high despite the gnawing feeling in her stomach. Something felt wrong. The usual greetings from coworkers were absent. The usual deference in their tones had been replaced with something else. Something colder. She didn't have to wait long to find out why. An email. Simple, sterile, direct. A meeting request with HR. Amanda. Victoria swallowed, her perfectly glossed lips pressing into a thin line. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't routine. She had built her career on reading between the lines, and right now, those lines were screaming at her. Still, she played her part. She walked into the meeting room with the same confidence she had always carried, flashing her signature smile as she took a seat. But the faces staring back at her weren't charmed. They were detached, professional, unreadable, and the questions began. Subtle at first, clarifications about a few numbers, an inquiry about an email she didn't remember sending, then sharper discrepancies in her expense reports, a flagged transaction, a missing signature. For the first time in a long time, Victoria felt something foreign creep up her spine. Doubt. This wasn't something she could flirt her way out of. This wasn't something she could manipulate into disappearing. This was real. And somewhere miles away, Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching the city skyline, knowing exactly what was unfolding. Victoria had always been her own greatest enemy. He had simply stepped aside and let her destroy herself. Victoria prided herself on being untouchable. She had built her life on perfectly curated illusions, charm, manipulation, and the ability to always stay 2 steps ahead. But illusions are fragile things. They shatter under the weight of truth, and Victoria was beginning to feel the cracks. Her meeting with HR had left her shaken, though she refused to let it show. She had walked out of that office with the same practiced poise, flashing a quick, confident smile at a passing colleague as if nothing had happened. But inside, her thoughts raced. Someone had been digging. The questions about financial discrepancies, about missing approvals, about transactions that didn't quite line up, she had handled them, deflected them, spun answers that were just plausible enough. But she wasn't stupid. She saw the way the compliance officer had watched her, the way HR had exchanged glances, their expressions carefully neutral. She had bought herself time, but time was no longer on her side. That evening, Victoria met Alex for dinner at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. She had hoped for reassurance, for the comfort of knowing she still had control somewhere. She had chosen her dress carefully, deep red, the kind that demanded attention. She arrived early, ordering an expensive bottle of wine, composing herself before he got there. When Alex finally arrived, she felt an immediate shift. His greeting was perfunctory, his usual charm absent. He didn't lean in for a kiss. He barely looked at her as he sat down, already scrolling through emails. She hated being ignored. "So," she said lightly, tilting her glass, watching him, How was your day? Alex didn't look up. One word. Cold. Detached. Victoria clenched her jaw. He had been growing distant for weeks now, but tonight something was different. She reached across the table, brushing her fingers against his wrist. Is something wrong? Alex finally looked at her then, his expression unreadable. He exhaled, set his phone down, and leaned back in his chair. I ran into Daniel today. The air seemed to still. Victoria's heart skipped, just for a second, just enough for Alex to notice. She forced a laugh. Daniel? What, my ex? What's he doing in your circles? Alex didn't smile. You tell me. There was something in his voice that made her uneasy. A sharpness, a weight. He didn't say much, Alex continued, swirling his whiskey, but he didn't need to. He fixed her with a look. You know what I hate more than anything, Victoria? She swallowed. What? Liabilities. The word hung between them like a blade. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She had never felt powerless in any of her relationships. Not with Daniel, not with anyone. But as she stared across the table at Alex, something in her stomach twisted. What are you saying? She asked, careful, controlled. Alex sighed as if he was already bored of the conversation. I'm saying I can't afford a scandal, Victoria. You know my position, my reputation. He took another sip of his drink. And right now, you're a risk. Her blood ran cold. Wait! Alex, this is ridiculous, she said quickly. What has Daniel even told you? He's just bitter. He wants to see me fail. Alex watched her, unmoved. Maybe. Or maybe he just made sure I started looking a little closer at you. He leaned in slightly. You really should have been more careful with your expenses. Victoria felt her stomach plummet. Alex knew she had underestimated him. She had assumed he wasn't the type to pay attention to details, that his wealth and status had made him indifferent to the small things. She had been wrong. Alex, she started, reaching for his hand, but he pulled away before she could touch him. I've already spoken to my lawyers, he said. Whatever we had, it's over. She felt the words like a slap. Over, she echoed, as if saying it aloud would make it less real. Alex sighed again, almost pitying. You thought you were playing a game, Victoria, but you never realized you were just a piece on the board. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Alex stood, tossing a few bills onto the table, and without another glance, he walked away. Victoria sat frozen, surrounded by the hum of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, the quiet murmurs of strangers. For the first time in her life, she didn't know what to do next. The storm came faster than she expected. By the next morning, the whispers had turned into conversations. Her boss called her into his office, his expression heavy. The compliance team had escalated their concerns. There were official investigations now. The missing funds, the discrepancies, they weren't just rumors anymore. She tried to fight, she tried to explain, but the problem with being a master manipulator was that eventually people caught on, and when they did, they stopped listening. By the end of the week, she was placed on administrative leave. By the end of the month, she was fired. And just like that, the world she had built started to crumble. Victoria sat in her apartment, staring at her phone. The messages had stopped. The invitations had dried up. She had tried calling Alex, no response. She had tried reaching out to colleagues, polite refusals. She had even tried, in a moment of desperation, to text Daniel. No reply. She was alone, truly, completely alone. She had spent years believing she was above consequence, that she could bend reality to her will, manipulate outcomes, control every narrative, but Daniel had never needed to destroy her. She had done it herself. And now, as she sat in her empty apartment, the silence deafening, the weight of her own choices pressing down on her like a vice, she finally understood. She had lost, and the worst part, she had never even realized she was playing the wrong game. Victoria had always believed in the power of perception. If she looked the part, if she played the role, then reality would bend to her will. But perception could only stretch so far before it snapped. And now, as she sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, the walls closing in on her, she realized there was no one left to fool. It had been weeks since her world collapsed. The termination from her job had been humiliating. Security had escorted her out, past colleagues who wouldn't meet her gaze. A few of them had whispered their condolences, but she saw the relief in their eyes. She had never made real allies, only temporary accomplices. Alex had cut ties cleanly. There was no dramatic confrontation, no lingering texts, no last-minute attempts to soften the blow. One day she was sipping expensive wine in his penthouse. The next, she was locked out of his life. And Daniel had vanished, not in the way she had expected. She thought he might gloat, might reach out with some smug remark, rubbing salt into her wounds. But there was nothing. He had simply disappeared from her world as if she had never existed in his. That was the part that gnawed at her the most. She could deal with anger, with confrontation, with attempts to win or reclaim power, but being discarded, forgotten, that was unbearable. At first, she convinced herself this was temporary. People had always gravitated toward her. She was too charming, too valuable to be ignored for long. She reached out to her friends, at least the ones who had once flooded her messages, eager to bask in her orbit. But the responses were lukewarm at best. Sorry, things have been crazy. Let's catch up soon. So sorry about everything. You'll bounce back, though. We'll talk soon. I hope you're doing okay. No one wanted to meet up. No one invited her to events. She scrolled through social media, seeing the parties, the gatherings, the trips, places she used to be, people she used to influence. She wasn't in the pictures anymore. Her calls went unanswered. Her texts remained unread. Victoria had never feared being alone. She had always assumed, no matter what, there would be someone to desire her, admire her, seek her approval. But now there was nothing but silence. The financial strain hit next. Her bank account, once comfortably padded, was depleting at an alarming rate. The luxury she had surrounded herself with, the designer clothes, the fine dining, the high-rise apartment, had never been truly hers. It had been built on borrowed wealth, on Alex's indulgence, on the cushioned stability of her former job. Now the rent was overdue, the unpaid credit card bills stacked higher each week. And the worst part, she had no idea how to fix it. For all her brilliance at navigating social circles, manipulating men, climbing the corporate ladder, she had never planned for failure. She had never needed to, until now. The panic set in when the eviction notice arrived. She had ignored the previous warnings, convinced she could talk her way out of it. But there was no landlord to charm, no loophole to exploit. For the first time in her life, Victoria was faced with a problem she couldn't outmaneuver. She called Alex. The number was disconnected. She tried his assistant. I'm sorry, Miss Carter, but Mr. Montgomery is unavailable. Click. She tried old friends, old lovers, anyone who might still see value in her. No one responded. Victoria Carter, the woman who once controlled every room she entered, had become invisible. She found herself in a cafe one afternoon, staring blankly at a half-empty cup of coffee she could barely afford. The once effortless elegance she had carried was slipping. Her designer clothes didn't look the same without the confidence to hold them up. Her makeup, usually flawless, had lost its purpose. She glanced around, scanning the cafe, searching for a familiar face. Some part of her hoped she would run into someone she knew, someone who would see her, recognize her, remind her of who she had been. And then she saw him, Daniel, sitting at a table near the window, engaged in quiet conversation with a woman Victoria didn't recognize. Victoria's breath hitched. He looked different, relaxed, at peace. He wasn't the Daniel she remembered, the one she had laughed at, the one she had dismissed, the one she had assured herself would never move on without her. But he had. She couldn't look away. She wanted to march over, to demand acknowledgement, to remind him that she still existed. But what would she say? That she was sorry? That she had made a mistake? That she missed him? The words lodged in her throat, useless, meaningless. Because Daniel didn't need to hear them, he had already won. She forced herself to look away, gripping the coffee cup so tightly her knuckles turned white. The weight of her own insignificance crushed her. She had thought losing her job was the worst part, then she had thought losing Alex was, then her social life, then her finances. But this was the real loss. She had lost the one thing she had always counted on, her power over people. And now she was just another forgotten face in a city that never stopped moving. Victoria closed her eyes, inhaling sharply. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to break. Not here. Not in front of him. But deep down she knew. She already had. Victoria always believed she would land on her feet. She had built her life on survival, on adaptation. Men, jobs, friendships, they were all interchangeable pieces in a game she had mastered. There was always another opportunity, another chance to reinvent herself. But this time she had nothing left to rebuild with. The eviction came faster than she expected. She had tried to negotiate, to stall for time, but the landlord had already made up his mind. There were no more favors to call in, no more strings to pull. The movers arrived early, carrying out her furniture like it was nothing. The luxury she had surrounded herself with, designer furniture, silk curtains, paintings she barely remembered buying, was reduced to boxes, stacked on the sidewalk like discarded remnants of a life she no longer owned. She stood there clutching a suitcase, watching as strangers walked past without a second glance. No one stopped to ask if she was okay. No one cared. She checked into a motel on the other side of town, the kind of place she once would have sneered at. The sheets smelled of bleach, the walls were thin, and the flickering neon sign outside cast eerie shadows across the room. She sat on the bed, scrolling through her phone, searching for someone, anyone who might still take her call. She considered calling Alex again. Then she thought of Daniel. She hesitated. She had spent weeks pretending he didn't exist, avoiding places where she might run into him, drowning in the knowledge that he had walked away from her so completely. But that moment in the cafe still haunted her. The way he had looked, at peace, as if she had never mattered at all. That was the real wound. Not losing Alex, not losing money, losing significance. She wasn't ready to accept that. Not yet. She took a breath, then typed out a message. Daniel, can we talk? She hit send and waited. The minutes stretched. An hour passed. Then 2. No reply. She sent it on the please, just one conversation. I need to see you. Still nothing. The silence was louder than any rejection. Days blurred together. She spent hours on job boards applying for positions she never would have considered before. Corporate firms weren't interested in someone who had been terminated under investigation. Small businesses didn't trust someone with her history. Even the industries she once looked down on, sales, retail, admin work, had little space for someone like her. She had no skills beyond manipulation, and without a position of power, manipulation was useless. Her savings dwindled. The motel bill piled up. The walls closed in. Victoria Carter was vanishing. One evening, after another round of rejected applications, she found herself scrolling through old photos. Parties, vacations, lavish dinners, images of a woman who had once been the center of everything. And then she found one she had forgotten existed. A picture of her and Daniel. They were at a rooftop bar, city lights sprawling behind them. It had been a warm summer night, and she was laughing, genuinely laughing, as he leaned in, whispering something only she could hear. She stared at the photo for a long time. She had never really looked at him before. Not the way she should have. Daniel had never been a man of power or status. He had never been the wealthiest or the most influential, but he had been solid, stable, the kind of man who didn't play games. And she had thrown him away, not because she didn't love him, but because she had never understood how to value him. By the time she saw him again, weeks had passed. She was walking through the city, lost in thought, when she spotted him outside a bookstore, laughing with the same woman from the cafe. His hand rested gently on the woman's back, a small familiar gesture, one Victoria recognized all too well. Her throat tightened. She could have walked away. She should have, but she didn't. Instead, she stepped forward, forcing a smile. Daniel. He turned at the sound of her voice, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition. Memory. Then it was gone. Victoria! His voice was polite, distant. That hurt more than anything. She searched his face for something, anger, bitterness, anything that meant she still mattered. But there was nothing. You didn't respond to my messages, she said, forcing a lightness she didn't feel. I know. Silence stretched between them. She wanted to explain, to tell him she had changed, that she understood now. That she was sorry, but the words wouldn't come because she knew it didn't matter. Daniel had already let her go, and for the first time she realized so had everyone else. She had spent her entire life making sure she was the one who left first. Now she was the one standing alone. She forced another smile, stepping back. Well, she said quietly, take care, Daniel. He nodded, and then just like that, he turned away. Victoria stood there, watching him walk off, disappearing into a world that no longer included her. And finally she understood. This wasn't just the end of a relationship. This was the end of her. The woman she had been, the one who controlled, who manipulated, who thrived on power, was gone. And in her place, there was nothing left. Nothing at all.